Okay, everyone, and welcome. This is Joe Sondry. I'm president of the National Spectrum Managers Association. Today, we're extremely pleased to have Trey Hanbury, a partner at Hogan Lovells, present on satellite mega constellations. And for those of you who don't know Trey, I want to go through his background and also just sort of walk through the program, how we typically organize it, so you can all understand how you can participate, and there are plenty of opportunities to participate during today's event. So Trey, known for many, many years as a partner at Hogan Lovells, he works with companies in the technology and telecom sector and also directly in satellite matters. He's, in addition to assisting clients in policy-making matters, he also helps clients obtaining regulatory authorizations to introduce new products and services, advises on licensing and commercial issues arising from federal FCC rules, policy changes, and regulatory investigations. And prior to joining Hogan Lovells, Trey served as Director of Government Affairs at Sprint Communications. He acted as regulatory counsel in major rulemaking proceedings, mergers and acquisitions, and cases before the FCC, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and the Department of Commerce, Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, Congress, and federal courts. So he's really widely versed in all these areas and communications law and their various institutions. He was recognized with the company's Leadership Excellence Award, which is the highest level of corporate recognition for directors, vice presidents, and senior executives. Prior to that role, Trey held various policymaking positions at the Federal Communications Commission, including working on numerous satellite and international telecom matters over at the International Bureau. He also served as special counsel in the Office of General Counsel, where he was responsible for providing policy and legal advice to the Office of Chairman on wireless issues. So we really want to welcome Trey. We appreciate his expertise today. Before we get underway, and Trey will walk you through this as well at different points, but we'll have breaks where you can have questions read out. If you have any thoughts you want, just drop them into the Q&A and the chat cycle. Our moderator keeps the microphones muted just so we don't have barking dogs or doorbells going off during the presentation. And otherwise, handing it over to Trey, and welcome aboard, Trey.
Joe, thank you for that great introduction. I couldn't be happier to be here and talk about Spectrum, which I think is just one of the most exciting areas of technology these days, and one of the areas that we're seeing the most creative innovation, not only in the business field, but in the legal and policy field as well. So I'm really pleased to talk to you all today, and I'll look forward to the Q&A too, where I anticipate lots of views and questions, and I hope they'll be forthcoming. Want to cover, hopefully if this thing will cooperate with me, cover a few logistical notes. Joe talked about it already, about the 3 breaks, very colorfully illustrated here. They'll be interspersed throughout the presentation, and we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. Wanted to give you a brief agenda of where we're going to go. We're going to talk about civilization, and by civilization I mean the existing and emerging NGSO FSS ecosystem. These are the most innovative, I think, or some of the most innovative satellite systems that are out there. They're putting new demands on old regulatory machinery. They are using the latest in technology to put new, mostly broadband communication systems in space, but they are targeting a lot of different markets with a lot of different types of services, and that leads to a lot of potential for conflict. And so, with apologies to Freud, I'm not only going to talk about civilization, but I'm going to talk about its discontents, which are many. So there are a lot of interference paths. There are different types of service providers, non-satellite providers, who are worried about these services and what havoc they might cause on their systems that are already existing. There are other NGSO applicants, so sometimes the greatest threat comes from one another in terms of potential interference. And there's a whole host of challenges and opportunities to resolve all of these disputes, and it really will depend on this struggle that I referenced in that quote above. Let's hope that the struggle is beautiful, but we'll see how it works. And ultimately, it's going to be up to people like those who are attending this call to figure out how we go about resolving it. Let me see if I can pull up the next slide here just to give you a sense of what civilization, as we might call it, looks like. We've got 17,000 satellites, more than 17,000 actually, already authorized from everyone such as SpaceX to Amazon to lesser known entities like Space Norway or Carousel. They're proposing a variety of models to reach consumers and a variety of services, everything from machine-to-machine communications like Kepler to Arctic broadband. Really, the polar regions are very underserved, as you might imagine, with broadband, and so Space Norway is targeting that area, unique in that respect. Many of you will be familiar with SpaceX and their very large constellation of satellite. And this is not over the horizon. These are licenses that they hold in hand already, authorized to launch, construct, and operate these systems. And so it's really just a matter of gaining access to space. The one that's defunct is LeoSat. I've scratched that off the list. And so we'll see how many of these actually are realized in the end, but right now, they're all viable. But that's not all, as they say. There's actually 81,000 more satellites that are pending with applications before the FCC to launch and operate. Now, a lot of the players from the last slide reappear here with requests to launch additional satellites. You'll notice SpaceX proposes to launch 30,000 more satellites in the E-band, the Ka band, the Ku band. And there's a little guide down there to tell you what's what on the bands, but a variety of frequencies, both commonly used and less commonly used. But others are in there too, Boeing, Viasat, Kepler, with a variety of aspirations for their constellation sizes in a variety of different bands. And the FCC is in the midst right now of processing these applications as well. And so we get the immediate question was, well, why all of a sudden are we seeing this explosion in ambition and investment in the space sector? And so for that, if you'll bear with me, hopefully this will work, have a little video. With any luck, we'll see if it can work. Okay. So one of the reasons that we're seeing that is this video, which hopefully will cooperate. Now, I watched this and I rewatched it and I rewatched it, and it's not an animation. This is SpaceX's Falcon 9 landing on board a vessel at sea in weather perfectly. And that's a reusable rocket, of course, and it's their hallmark, and it is massively lowering the cost of access to space. And it's making these very ambitious systems all of a sudden incredibly real. Because you can imagine if we had a single-use car, we wouldn't drive very often. But when we have reusable cars, we use them all the time. And that's exactly what's happening here. And so,
Trey, just real quick, are you seeing that on your screen? We're not seeing it on our screen.
Oh, you're not seeing it? Ah, that's too bad.
What you could probably do is, if you're able to, are you able to stop sharing your current screen, play the video, and share that? Do you know how to do that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I probably have the technology to that. It is pretty amazing.
There we go.
Okay. 1 second.
And while that's going on, so NGS, I think most of the people here are pretty well versed in the different types of satellite, but are you able to spell out what an NGSO and FSS is for folks who might be terrestrial managers who aren't really?
Sure. So an NGSO system is one that is non-geostationary in relation to the Earth. So it moves in relation to the Earth, in contrast to a geostationary system, which, if you were looking straight up, would be in the same place in the sky. So let me rewind this.
There we are.
Okay, are you seeing it now?
We are.
Okay, well, this is that video that I was talking about earlier about watching and rewatching. Let me press play. Hopefully the miracle of technology will work.
It's
a lot. Yeah. you see a lot of animations in the space sector of what the future will look like. Not an animation. These are real waves. This is real weather. It's a moving platform on water with a reusable rocket landing perfectly upon it. It is, I think, truly one of the marvels of engineering. And as I said, it's massively lowering the cost of access to space. It's truly just an incredible feat. So with that, let me go back to the other little video I wanted to share with you before this starts to play something else. Can you see a screen now, Joe, with the Earth behind it, or do I need to share?
Okay. You nailed it, just like
all right. So remember I talked about all those satellites. This is a visualization. Actually, it's about, it's a visualization of what all those satellites will look like. On your left, you can see what the satellites start to feed into this simulation are, and the different launch dates that they're expected, or at least on paper, anticipated being. They estimate 57,000 satellites. I think the actual sought out, both the licensed and the applied for satellites are, as I said, more numerous than that, closer to 100,000. And so it starts to get pretty congested pretty quickly. But I think the point here is not so much to talk about congestion or real debris, although they're really interesting issues that we should probably talk about at some point. The issue is, I think, more properly thought of just how ambitious the agenda here is in terms of the number of satellites that are being launched and the different models that they're all pursuing. So let me go back to my slide presentation. With any luck, this will work as well. There we go. Okay, thank you. So those were my videos. We passed through the fun video stage, and now you've got me. The point that I wanted to raise with this slide is that all of these operators, I think, are incredibly excited about the market opportunity that they have. This is a chart pulled out of a fairly standard business deck. There are different ways to win customers. There are different markets to access. You could be just optimizing your existing product mix. You could be moving into an adjacent market. You're a broadband provider today. You want to reach that extra geography or slightly enhance the product you're offering. Most of the players in this market are really looking at some kind of transformational change. They want to develop a new product. They want to reach new markets that have not been served before. And they're going to be offering a lot of different innovative products. And I think that's something to stress. While a lot of them are focused on broadband, others are focused on IoT, remote sensing, tracking, even on-demand video delivery. There's one applicant in particular that has a cache and forward kind of video service so that you could watch Netflix even if you don't have broadband, where it would download overnight a full content essentially to a hard drive that would then deliver your products in real time or seemingly real time without actually streaming back to the larger internet. So lots of innovation happening in the space. No one kind of killer app yet, though there's obviously a great deal of interest in broadband because it's such a flexible platform. So I talked about the discontents. Let's turn to those after our tour through Civilization. We've got doubters for sure, and I don't think it would be fair to just talk about the grand aspirations of all the applicants. Tim Farrar is a satellite communications consultant. He's quite well versed on these matters. And he's also quite blunt in his assessment of the viability of these systems. He says, if they think they're competing against terrestrial providers, given the economics, they're kidding themselves. They're deluding themselves. The economics are challenging, even with lower access to space. It's still a very costly, very risky proposition. And there are a lot of satellites that need to get into orbit. And so you're talking about new production lines, new ways of building satellites, new ways of launching satellites, new ways of communicating with ground equipment that will have to be designed, built, distributed, sold, marketed. And you'll have to educate a whole class of consumers on how to use these products, or enterprises, I suppose. The other kind of discontents are the incumbents, and we'll talk about these in a series of case studies later. One set of incumbents involves the DBS operators. This is the standard Dish, now AT&T, formerly DirecTV, or DirecTV by AT&T. But this is in-home video from a satellite, from a geostationary satellite, quite distant from the Earth. They're a little concerned about interference, especially in the KU band. There are also the UMFUS, which it's a terrible acronym, but it is a good service. It's the upper microwave fixed, why am I blanking? That's right, upper microwave flexible use service. Good service, bad name. It is millimeter wave spectrum that will be used for 5G. It is co-primary with a number of satellite, or actually, well, there are some adjacent bands that can interfere with satellite services, or could experience or could cause interference into satellite services. And so there are these contours that exist to protect existing and future satellite deployments from the more powerful, closer to the ground UMFUS base stations and handsets. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, there are these rival non-geostationary fixed satellite service systems that all have different architectures and business models and different views of interference. You know, if there's one nice thing that the terrestrial operators have going for them, they all rely on the same handful of manufacturers, and they use the same basic structure of base stations and handsets provided by the same number of vendors. And so their systems wind up looking very similar. And we've had these great standards wars before, where you had, for instance, IDEN versus GSM versus CDMA. And I think eventually everything coalesced around GSMA now, or GSM, now LTE. In the satellite world, there's no such standardization. We have I think a much more innovative, dynamic environment, but that also means there's more potential for conflict, and it's not always easily resolved. You just can't dial up Ericsson and have them solve your problem. You're going to have to work it out. And that's an important consideration to keep in mind as we go through this. So let's talk about the interference risk. And this goes to your question, Joe, a little bit about what is an NGSO. So again, non-geostationary, the satellite itself is moving in relation to the Earth. The antennas are going to some degree, track that satellite. It doesn't have to be mechanical. It can be electronic. It can be beamforming to direct the receiver or transmitter to focus on that distant satellite, either as it traverses its path, it's through orbit, or to go from one satellite to the next. And mostly, with the more numerous, these mega constellations, there will be so many satellites orbiting around in a low Earth orbit that there will almost always be one overhead. And if you can, you want to hit the closest satellite because it travels less distance and it has less of a chance to run into clutter on the ground and experience interference from atmospheric attenuation or other events along the way. So the shortest distance between 2 points is what they want to travel. But that's not always possible. And so the risk really for all types of interference, and we'll be talking about this a lot, is alignment. So if you've got multiple NGSO systems and you're trying to communicate to the same point as that other or nearby system, it can affect or damage, impair the signal. And that's really the issue, because almost all of these satellites are using all of the available spectrum. And by and large, sharing works because space is awfully big. But there are times when those NGSO satellites, because they are so numerous and because they are traveling all through various different types of orbit at different altitudes as well, that they will overlap or come close enough to one another that they could be aimed at the same, or that transmitters going up could be aimed at the same point. As they look down on Earth, consumers are not evenly distributed throughout the planet. Instead, they congregate in different hubs and areas of activity. That's certainly true for base stations, Earth stations, like gateway Earth stations, where these are massive, essentially feeder links, backhaul links, if you were thinking in terrestrial terms, where they're going to either send up traffic to the satellite or take it down. But it's also true with consumers too. They're not evenly distributed. In fact, they cluster. And when two different operators are trying to get to the same place at the same time, there could be alignment. And that's a problem if you're a satellite operator for sure. So what do you do to avoid it? You avoid alignment. And luckily, you've got a lot of solutions. Here are two very simplistic solutions to avoid alignment. One, use a different satellite. If you've got two satellites close together, one of the operators, or maybe even both, should use a different satellite. Let's create that diversity, even if it doesn't exist. So in this example on the left, you might have two satellites right close to one another where they could overlap. What we want is to spread them out. And even though the Earth stations are quite close, that satellite diversity will provide us with a clear path to the user. Another way, use a different Earth station. So if we have a number of gateway Earth stations, it might be equally desirable to use a different gateway Earth station so that we could manage that interference. And again, avoiding alignment allows us to establish that clear signal path to the system and maintain communications. Now, the problem is that it's not that simple. You could have different kinds of antennas. And remember, we've got different operators with different visions of the world, different services they're going to offer. So if satellite operator A, in our example on the left, has a low gain antenna, very wide open in that sense, it's going to see more, to use a visual analogy. It could limit the ability or the value of satellite diversity to really help B. In other words, it's going to, or to help either operator, because essentially there's going to be this overlap because that low gain antenna is going to be receiving broadly. Same thing with Earth station diversity. Remember, we've got all these satellites at all kinds of different altitudes. And so if one has really large spot beams, but the other has really small spot beams, the other, even though it could use a different Earth station, it's not far enough away to get outside of that gargantuan spot beam that satellite A is casting down on the planet. Now, complicating that even a little bit further is that most of these satellites are in low Earth orbit or in some variation of that. And while speeds can vary depending on a number of factors, these are moving at about 17,000 miles an hour, give or take. So these things are happening very fast. And that's sort of both a blessing and a curse. It means this kind of handoff, these sort of calculations need to happen very rapidly if you're going to avoid that. And the good news with that is the duration of the event may not last that long either, but there's a lot of complexity, and it could be long or it could be short, depending on the particular alignment and the configuration and the availability of alternatives. Okay, so now that we walked through the basic mechanics and some of the basic tools and terminology, I thought it would be a good time to take the first break.
Great, Trey. One, those are really helpful explanations to help everyone visualize. And not surprisingly, we got a lot of deep thinkers on Spectrum, and they have questions. So I'll start with first on the list, Michael Jamilkowski. You want to know, what do you think about the effectiveness of exclusion zones? I'm sort of reading into that, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being incredibly effective. Where do you think they really apply?
Yeah, I think exclusion zones are very effective and very costly. So, having that kind of hard rule, thou shalt never go within X miles of this area or this receiver, incredibly effective, but it's also, it imposes real cost on the ability to serve that area by another operator or to offer innovative services in a way that might increase consumer welfare. So certainly it's a tool in the toolkit, but probably a last resort because of the costs it imposed. And that's the thing that I think we'll want to emphasize throughout this, is that there are a lot of tools that could work. It's really just finding the right balance in making sure that we're weighing cost and benefit. both to the individual rights holder and to the community at large. And that's a difficult path to walk.
Yeah. And what do you think from a regulatory feasibility with exclusion zones? Is that, you know, how feasible are they to even get approved?
I think the FCC is very sensitive to the cost that exclusion zones impose, right? It is a blunt force measure. You know, it's why you apply the tourniquet as the last resort. You know, if your patient's going to die, then you apply the tourniquet, but you generally don't use that as the first course of action, right? You try to work from small measures to larger ones, because you'll know that will work, but it comes at an enormous price.
Yeah, great, thanks. We have another question, David Lubar. He wanted to know, how do we model a particular constellation when they plan gateways with partners that are maybe not yet negotiated, and also unstated regional gateways?
Yeah, so every gateway will need to be licensed by the FCC. And so there is especially in the UMFUS bands or UMFUS adjacent bands as well, there is a whole process, and there are limits, numerical limits by county on how many you can seek. And each one will face constraints on how much population it can cover. And the idea is pretty simple. The FCC auctioned some of these millimeter wave frequencies that are now licensed under the UMFUS moniker. And they don't want to take away too much of the population from those licensees, because it'll destroy the value of the licenses if they do. So there are sharp limits on that. There is an application process, and all of that's publicly available, and in some cases contested as different applicants try to vie for these rights to build earth stations in locations that are desirable, and typically fed by fiber, near urban areas. You know, there are clearly a hierarchy of locations that are more or less valuable, and they're prized. So it's a public process and open to participation and challenge.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks. I'm thinking, I know we have another break. We kind of, I think, to keep on cadence, we do have another question there, but we'll save it for the next break, and we'll keep going. First, and just as a reminder to everyone, first questions in are the first ones answered. So first in, first out. Okay, thanks, Trey.
All right, sure. Well, thanks. So we've got lots of different challenges we talked a little bit about. We do have this moment to we could do diversity, satellite diversity, earth station diversity, but there's some limitations on our ability to do that. We talked about the speed at which these LEOs are traveling, and so that requires moment-to-moment scheduling, some real-time communications between different systems, some of whom are rivals in the commercial marketplace, and you're talking about a lot of information sharing among them. You also have a demand for some fairly sophisticated satellite control systems in place, and that's not always existed, right? You've got a lot of different companies with a lot of different models. Some of them may be able to deploy satellite diversity in real time. Others may not, and there is no requirement that they do so at present. So that's potentially a limitation, depending on just what's been baked into the design. The other thing is that you also have a lot of false positives. So if you'll remember that graphic we saw at the outset with, almost, in the case of the graphic, 57,000 satellites shown, although we anticipate as many as 100,000. With so many satellites all traversing the Earth at such a high rate of speed, you're going to get a lot of false positives where alignment occurs, but they're not actually transmitting at that time, or they're not actually receiving at that time. And so how do you weed out the false positives from the real positives? And that's a challenge as well. As I mentioned, they're targeting the same areas. The population is not evenly distributed. You're going to hit these hot spots. And so you'll have to pay more attention to that. And the other thing is, and we'll talk more about this later, there are asymmetric risks, costs, and benefits. In some cases, the most efficient solution may impose more cost on one operator rather than the other, but it is the lowest cost to avoid the harm. Well, do we require that one low-cost operator to take care of it? Or do we disperse the cost in the name of equity among multiple operators, even though that's not the most efficient solution? Or vice versa. And so these are the kind of policy issues where input from spectrum managers of all kinds are really going to be important, because there is no right answer. It's really about what values you bring to the table and what you ultimately want to see happen in the marketplace. And against all of that backdrop, you've got these enduring questions that go back to fundamentals about what is interference. Well, does it mean some kind of corporate lost profit, lost revenue? Or is it about a service outage or a service degradation? Or is it strictly just a matter of, counting hertz or counting RF emissions? So is it interference to noise? Is it a signal to noise ratio? So there might, for instance, be a rise in the noise floor, but you never experience an outage. Is that a false positive? Or is that something we actually want to try to solve for? Vice versa, or to give another alternative, it might be a degradation in service quality, but it could be imperceptible to that particular service. Do we care about that? Hard to say. It's very contextual. It requires a case-by-case analysis and really will require careful thought by the commission and strong advocacy, I think, from this, from our sector and community. So that question naturally arises, hey, don't we have rules for this? Well, yes, we do. We have some rules governing inter-round and intra-round sharing. And so let me talk a bit about what a round is. In order to afford equal opportunity to all applicants, what the FCC typically does is when they receive a new kind of satellite application, they pause processing of that application. They open up a round. They ring the dinner bell and ask other applicants to come forward with proposals that are similar in nature. Same band, same architecture, same frequency allocations. So when that happens, you get a processing round, and all of those applicants are processed together. And the idea is all applicants in a round get the same rights as against one another. Subsequent round applicants will get something less than those rights, but everyone who comes into the process at the same time will get the same right. Okay, well, that seems pretty fair. So what does that mean in practice? Well, we've got then two types of interference considerations or sharing considerations we need to think about. How do we share among systems in a round? And then how do we share among systems that are in subsequent rounds with the prior round systems? There is another rule as well, and it deals with, well, what happens when we license a system in the first round and then it decides to change how it does business, how it will provide service, the number of satellites that it has, even the frequencies that it uses. The commission basically has said that we'll tend to grant that application, but there are certain disqualifying circumstances. And largely, this remains an open issue as well. So we've got some fairly vague standards. We know we have rounds. We know that original round applicants or licensees are supposed to have somewhat more rights than later round applicants, and that if you modify your system too much, you might find yourself put into a later round and therefore have somewhat less right. All right, that seems fair in principle. The problem is the practice. So one issue right off the bat is that processing rounds can be waived. Every rule the commission has can, with the public interest showing, be waived. The commission has waived processing rounds before. And so they've opened up processing rounds and put new people in it. I mean, if you miss it by a day, your system looks just like the other system, why not? Especially if sharing is feasible, should that party not have similar rights. The other is the standard for interference that will typically result in some type of sharing among the systems is very low, very, very low. It's defined by 6% delta T over T. It's a very small, relatively small increase in interference potential, if you will, and it may not actually have any real effect on performance. the idea originally as crafted was to encourage collaboration, encourage sharing in this enterprise of commercializing space. We're all in this together, and we want to see multiple systems work. And putting all of our eggs in one basket would be a bad strategy. So encouraging collaboration, especially in something as vast as space, could lead to more systems becoming viable at the end of the day. Of course, the problem is, as we've seen more and more systems come to nearly commercial fruition, the potential sharing dynamics become very complicated. You've got multiple systems, in fact, with some operators having multiple rounds of systems with ostensibly different rights, all of whom have to share and negotiate among one another. Sounds like a great opportunity for lawyers. It probably is. And by the way, for better or worse, there haven't been that many occasions where you have multiple rounds of licensees operating simultaneously. What has historically happened is the FCC will license a round of applicants, and those applicants either they go bankrupt, they fail to realize their commercial ambitions, or no one follows them. And so while in theory, the earlier in time applicants have more rights than the later in time applicants or round participants, the FCC has not really put meat on the bones of what that means, right? Is it, if you're a later in time, you always lose? You lose 90% of the time, 5% of the time? It remains undefined. And what is a loss? And how do we define, again, how do we define interference? It's not very sharp or very clear. And both SpaceX and Amazon and other operators have all weighed in on fundamental changes to how these rules, the round framework, the modification framework, how they're supposed to work. So yes, we have rules, but the FCC doesn't have a great experience in applying those rules. And the rules themselves are subject to change. There are multiple outstanding petitions for rulemakings to tweak how those rules work in practice and in theory. And so right now, before the FCC is the job of defining how these rights are going to work and what sort of balance we're going to strike. And all of us will have a voice in that policy making process. And it's going to take some time to figure out either how to interpret the existing rules in ways that achieve our shared goal of commercializing space, or to adopt new rules to achieve that same goal. And ultimately, what we're trying to do, I think, although happy to hear from others on this, is balance the need for reasonable reliance against this desire to promote competitive entry and innovation. We don't want to stifle new entry in the interest of allowing a already licensed system to proceed forward. It's about balancing the two, and it is a difficult rope to walk. Okay, so there's another short break, and I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Great, thanks, Trey. We have a question from Mark McHenry. He wants to know, are the satellite users all on different or the same frequencies? And to flesh that out a little more, there obviously are competing systems, which you already showed. In many respects, how many of them are using the same band, and how many are using multiple bands, and are using different bands? I think to kind of flesh that out.
Yeah. So I think the way to think about it is there are three big bands being used or proposed to be used. There's KU band, which is 12 to 16, 17 gigahertz. There's K band, which is say 24 to 34 gigahertz. And then there's V band, which is 40 to 60 gigahertz. Reasonable minds differ on exactly where these boundaries are drawn. But so you've got basically 12, 24, 40 for the frequencies. And when I said they're all using the same frequency, when an applicant applies for KU band spectrum, they tend to use all of the spectrum in KU that's assigned or assignable to FSS. There are some exceptions, but by and large, they try to use all the frequencies. Same with KA. There are a limited number of globally harmonized satellite frequencies, NGSO FSS frequencies, and they try to use all the available spectrum. And so not all systems use the same band segments. So for instance, SpaceX has rights in KU and KA bands. Amazon now has rights in KA band only, not KU. And so different operators have different mixes of systems. And there's another question too. If you have another band to fall back on, and you have to share in one band, should you be more likely to give way in the band that's shared because you have a backup, you have a spare? Or was that, some kind of foresight that should be rewarded by, a beneficial right? And so it's a really interesting rights question, I think, from my point of view. But these operators are mostly clustered in the KA band. There are a few in KU. And I think V band is largely regarded as the next generation of systems that will be commercialized once, or whether or not, once we determine whether KA band or KU, these lower frequencies, can actually support commercial operations.
Great. David Lubar asks, is there a summary of processing rounds for NGSO listed in one place at the NFC.gov?
That's a good question. I don't know whether we'll make available those slides, but I could. The slides 2 or 3 in my little deck there aren't a bad summary of where things stand. I don't know that their FCC has published a ready-made summary, but you're giving me a good idea for like a blog or something like that. So maybe we'll put that together.
What happens when you talk
post
to, yeah, that's what happens when you talk to spectrum managers. You get
good.
You get relevant questions. So that would be awesome if you did publish such a blog.
Yeah, we'll do that.
James Wolfson over at X.dot asks, don't other countries have to be taken into account as far as interference is concerned?
Absolutely. Yeah, we really haven't talked much about the international dimension, but there is a lengthy and elaborate process that goes on at the ITU, first to harmonize the allocation, and then to register, advance publish and ultimately publish different types of systems. There are different priority rights among those systems. Companies use different filing jurisdictions to try to gain date priority for different rights to different types of orbital or space segments and frequency rights. And there is an entirely different dimension on the international scale. It's one that we really shouldn't lose sight of at all, and it is critically important. It's not one that I have time to cover here in great depth, but it is a huge other element of this kind of three-dimensional chess, as they talk about, that each operator has to consider. Where have you filed? When did you file? What rights is that entitled you to? And who else has claim to those rights? And are they ahead of you? Are they behind you? Are they real? Are they paper? And it's the subject of a whole different presentation, I think.
Yeah, and I think you did say pretty presciently at the top, there's a whole series of subset issues here that could take up whole webinars and whole books probably. And we'll probably touch on some of those in the later round. There's one quick, before we go to go back to the slides, Harvey List makes a, sort of the etymology of KA and KU band observation. I think it's more of an observation. I'm not sure if this is a question. He's a radio astronomer. He was stating that KA band and KU band, I guess the history, he says the U stands for under and the A stands for above. And in the middle, I'm not sure, he said in the middle, 18 to 26 gigahertz is K band. This is a radio astronomer.
That makes perfect sense. I have never heard that before, and upon hearing it, I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah.
I had heard, the lore that I had heard is they devised these band names in part to keep the frequencies difficult to remember. You've got L band, S band, X band, E band. They're all over the place. There aren't in any logical order, and I had understood that was by design, so that when if someone heard tuned to S band, you wouldn't quite know what that was unless you were a spectrum.
Unless you had business there. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Mr. List, for sharing your etymology. All right, so and then there'll be another Q&A later, and back to Trey. Thanks,
Okay.
Trey.
Sure. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about one of the use cases that I mentioned at the top, DBS. And so what's the risk of NGSO FSS into DBS? DBS operates in the KU band, 12 gigahertz range, and they have for years. And you may have seen that their subscriber numbers depends on the operator, but they're not in the growth phase of their business. I think it's safe to say. AT&T has said that they've launched their last satellite. Still, there are tens of millions of Americans who receive multi-channel video service from these DBS providers. Now, those DBS satellites are geostationary in orbit. They are far away from the Earth's surface, and because of their altitude, they are able to rotate consistent with the Earth, so they always stay a fixed point above. And as they do that, they are able to continuously broadcast satellite television. Now, the problem comes when those NGSO satellites start appearing on the scene. They're using the same frequency, and in the aggregate, or potentially even singularly, the idea is they could make so much noise in the band that the DBS receivers at the end user's house, on their rooftop, on their porch, can no longer distinguish between the NGSO noise that they don't want and the DBS signals that they do. And so the ITU, we had the question a little bit about the international aspect. There are some rules governing just how much noise can be emitted on a cumulative basis in the band. It's measured by EPFD, and I give you the definition here. But the idea is you can, if you're far away, if you're at a different axis, you shouldn't have to take into account all transmitters at a given angle, but within a range, you should be able to, or you should be protected from the cumulative emissions that exist. Well, what's happened recently, and this is the subject of debate, and I'm involved in this proceeding, so I need to be a little bit careful here, but I think everything that I'm saying is, I know everything I'm saying is on the record, and it's also just a matter of publicly documented information. So Dish has come in and said, look, SpaceX has recently proposed to change its configured system. And when it does that, we worry that the cumulative noise that's going into our DBS receivers that are on millions of consumers' rooftops and porches will experience too much noise and lose connectivity to our multi-channel video service. And so one thing that SpaceX has done, and I've got a before and after graphic here, you can see the distant DBS satellite, 35,000 kilometers above Earth, with the existing SpaceX shell. They have different shells. There's one at lower altitude than this, but the existing shell is 1,300 kilometers, and that's about two-thirds of their satellite, give or take. SpaceX wants to pull that in closer to the Earth, and that's a concern because, of course, if they're closer to the Earth, they're that much more powerful to the end user, and you're also potentially bringing them closer together such that there's a denser net of them. And so you can see that on some of the next slides. The other thing that's being done is the number of orbital planes, and this is really the challenge when you're thinking in 3 dimensions. It's not as simple as a linear alignment. You have to think what's happening on all the different axes, X, Y, and Z. But in this case, instead of traveling a relatively small number of paths, 123, they'll be traveling on many more paths across that same that same closer in trajectory, and that really does create a tighter net that the DBS signal will have to travel, and that's what's shown here. And cumulatively, Dish is saying that this poses a risk to our end users, that we have reasonably relied on this being a fairly quiet band, and all of a sudden it could get quite noisy if we're not very careful. And so they have asked for SpaceX to sort of prove that they won't exceed these ITU levels. And it's a bit complicated because it's not only their system, it is other systems as well. And so how do you account for all these systems? And how do you how do you ensure that we don't have millions of angry consumers marching up to the commission demanding or complaining about interference to their system? And so that's a live debate that SpaceX is going through as they try to enter this market using the Ku band spectrum that's already in use today. How will it work? What types of interference effects will it have on existing services that are completely separate from the type of broadband deployment that SpaceX wants to offer? Another case study would be NGSO FSS ESIMs, which is another acronym I'll unpack in a second, into UMFUS. And if somebody's just tuning in, they will wonder what the hell we're talking about. But it's non-geostationary Earth orbits, Earth stations in motion. So it's a bit of a misnomer to just think about fixed satellite service as fixed. There are these things called Earth stations in motion. Now they are more in the sense of transportable, but they do introduce more than an element of mobility into the FSS allocation. Used to be very clear. If you were going to do mobile, you would do MSS, mobile satellite service. And then there was this bright line, and then you could do fixed satellite service. And ESIMs kind of blend the two and make that line a little blurrier. So when NGSO operators introduce ESIMs, these mobile type transportable units, really, on tops of buses, on tops of airplanes, things like that, they provide a lot of value. There are a lot of places where terrestrial wireless broadband won't work very well. Airplanes being a great example. But we talked earlier about how there are these new terrestrial 5G allocations that are bumping up against, or in some cases overlapping with, these satellite allocations. And so Verizon and US Cellular won a bunch of spectrum in the 28 gigahertz band. They paid a pretty penny for it. And they have now come forward and say, look, Commission, you're authorizing these mobile devices with us. And you know what they're concerned about? Alignment. Here is a graphic right from Verizon showing. And you can see the plane where an eSIM would be deployed on its roof. And the angle that Verizon shows is to the NGSO satellite in the distant orbit. And right on top of the airport sits a 28 gigahertz UMFUS BS base station. And it's right in that line of sight. And we're going to have alignment with that transmission. So now you have this powerful transmitter trying to reach space, going directly bore site into bore site with our sensitive UMFUS receiver. Now, there are a couple of issues with this that I think the ESIM advocates have pointed out. One is the NGSO satellites are moving, and if this exists at all, this type of alignment, it's not going to last for long. That satellite is moving fast, so this might be a second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, depends on the satellite, depends on the service, depends on other things. The other thing is the NGSO ESIM unit itself that's on the ground is probably not going to stay there. The plane will come in, it'll come out, it's going to move around. And then another factor is what is the sort of time element. Not all the time will that ESIM be transmitting when the base station's receiving, the UMFUS base station receiving, and vice versa. And so all these factors, the UMFUS proponents say, make that likelihood of interference less likely. Plus, they say there are these commercial incentives that can't be ignored. UMFUS is probably going to be deployed in high density, high population areas. ESIMs are probably not going to try to shoot through the clutter to some NGSO satellite just over the horizon. They're going to try to go for the straightest path to that satellite, which will tend to be in clear sky conditions. Won't always be possible. Remember, we've got to avoid other satellite systems, for example, to achieve satellite diversity if we can, and avoid other satellite operators. But where we can, we're going to try to avoid that long, low path through clutter, which isn't terribly efficient for them. And then they say, look, you got to account for the time considerations. Again, all of these things are going to be happening in real time, and we're talking about 2 mobile systems. So really what we need to do is to run a statistical analysis and plot hundreds or thousands of different episodic incidents of interference and look at things cumulatively. And when we do, we find that the risk here is going to be limited in time, very fleeting, and fairly infrequent. And so this is another open issue. Defining, is it an absolute bar? Should it be statistically modeled? How do we take into account commercial incentives? And how do we promote negotiations among different types of interests that historically haven't seen eye to eye? So give a couple of examples here from the record. I won't read these to you, but it is an active docket. And the probability issue becomes pretty significant because interference is probabilistic in this case, because it really does depend on whether all the stars align to create that kind of boresight to boresight interference condition that would really prove devastating. And Amazon at least thinks that they're not all that likely to happen simultaneously. So with that, I'll take our third short break and see any questions that we have.
Yeah, we got a few. KC asks, can you talk a little bit about the interference issues between cellular stations and microwave fixed services, how the satellite companies deal with it and avoid it in shared bands?
I will probably take a pass on that question because I don't know exactly how they're addressing, fixed users. I do know there are certain limits on their ability to access certain areas, going back to the issue of exclusion zones. But by and large, with fixed links, you can navigate around them. They have the benefit of not moving. And so you don't put your gateway earth station in the line of a fixed link, right? Or vice versa. And so it's a fairly static environment and you can plan around it. Whereas these other environments that we're talking about, satellite, either fixed or mobile or ESIM, and 5G mobile operations, these are very dynamic environments that require a lot of give and take, a lot of coordination, and a lot of real-time negotiation of this changing condition.
Okay. There's a question, will the slides be made available? And I know the recording is, and the slides, we can post them like we normally do.
Sure.
Okay, thank you for that. And then another question, what spectrum sharing technical approaches are being proposed?
There are a number of approaches. Most of them revolve around that trigger for negotiation, 6% delta T over T being the sort of the main watchword. But I think at the moment, the idea is to keep a whole panoply of options on the table and see what you can do to allow for coexistence and not rule anything out. So there's a pretty broad toolkit, and it almost has to be broad because we're talking about different satellite designs, different orbital configurations, different frequencies of operation. And so there are a lot of tools in the toolkit to use for any given situation. I don't think anybody wants to say, okay, in this situation, you must use this. In this other situation, you must use this. There could be all kinds of negotiations among the parties, which could be commercial. There may need to be default rules for what happens. Right now, though, the idea is if you can't figure out a way to share on a private party-to-party basis, then we split the spectrum. And that's essentially applying the tourniquet to the situation, because then instead of having access to the full amount of spectrum, you could be, if you're in with one other operator, you could have 50% of it. Or if you're in a kind of an environment where you have 3 or 4 or 5 operators all hitting alignment at the same time, you could really be crunched down to a very narrow amount of bandwidth. And once you back off from the band edges and meet other criteria to protect the other users, that splitting could result in a very dramatic degradation in performance. And so what we have is a rule that encourages strongly party-to-party sharing, through the draconian remedy of spectrum splitting. And so the issue before the commission right now is, what can we do to try to provide some stutter steps before we get to that draconian remedy? And how can we provide those stutter steps without being prescriptive in a way that would unduly limit what we can do in terms of solutions?
Very good. All right. All right. And then I guess we can move to the next piece.
Okay, great. Let's give it a shot. So we talked about NGSO FSS against NGSO FSS. These sort of the sharpest battles are among your own kind, I guess. And this is a graphic that cropped up in an Amazon filing. And it's a little hard to read even on a screen, but the basic idea is there are a couple of ways, there are actually an infinite number of ways you could solve for an alignment event, a real alignment event, one that would actually not just result in alignment, but actually some degradation in performance. You could have one operator solve it, or you could have both operators solve it. And what this graphic is basically telling you, and there's a detailed legend at the bottom, is that by and large, when both parties do a little bit, you get a better result. And that's essentially what Amazon is advocating for, is to have both parties spend a little bit of, it could be resources on it, computing resources in the satellite. It could be a less desirable Earth station location. It could be something else. So give a little bit, and it will result in a much better interference environment for both of us. There will be less expenditure. The rub, as SpaceX has complained, is, look, but wait, we were in the first round and you're in the second round. That means our status as a first round licensee means never having to say we're sorry. So yeah, it's going to be awful for you. It might cost more for you, but that's part of the bargain. You should have applied a few months earlier. Well, maybe, but that's the avenue that the commission is trying to navigate right now. So I threw up this whole, I went down, it's COVID time, so I have some time on my hands. So I was thinking about what sort of ethical world, we're trying to live in here. And I think it really is this debate between utilitarian ethics and deontological ethics. Now, this is not what you tuned in for this webinar for, but the idea with utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number, that we don't think about what the benefit is for me, because your benefit is also my collective benefit. This is kind of the John Stuart Mill world, where we, by bringing up all voices, essentially, we benefit ourselves. And the other is this deontological ethic, really embodied by Kant, where we follow the rules to the letter, and in so doing, we promote the greater good through that way. So if our rule is we will not lie, we don't lie, it doesn't matter, even if that would be painful for our personal life or our marriage or whatever, we just have a rule, we don't ever lie. It works, I suppose, but it is done regardless of the consequences of those actions. And so I think, if we're going to wax philosophical, as you maybe only can do on a webinar, you want to think about what model is the right one here. Is it one that tries to do the greatest good for the greatest number at the least cost? Or is it one that's going to be hidebound to the rules and say, look, we need to create incentives for those first in time applicants, even if that imposes extraordinary cost on later in time applicants? I don't know that there's a right answer there. People still study philosophy. They still think about Mill and Kant, Freud and others, about how you assess rights and think about the greater good. We're not going to solve it on this call, but I thought it was really an interesting kind of sidelight. Changing gears once more, it kind of harks back to what we're talking about with the SpaceX mod and the concerns that DBS operators have raised. So when SpaceX modified its system, what happens to that later in time system? So does it throw them into a subsequent processing round with lesser rights, or does it allow them to stay in that original processing round? The idea that SpaceX has advanced is, look, satellites for too long have been in this very languid deployment pace. You design your system, and then 4 or 5 years later, you have it all approved, and then 4 or 5 years after that, you're in production, and then another few years you're actually launching, and then it has a 20-year lifespan. And that's not our model. SpaceX would say we're all about failing fast, failing often. We're going to innovate. We're going to iterate on our system. Sure, satellites will fail in orbit, but we're going to launch more. We got these really efficient, low-cost rockets that are reusable that we saw at the outset. We've lowered the cost of space, and so we can afford to have these things not be engineered to last 20 years. In fact, in low Earth orbit, they're not even going to be up there 20 years. So it is only natural, SpaceX would say, to have our system change with the vast majority of our satellites being lower in altitude, the number of satellites we see from the ground to more than double, to change the elevation angles. How low can you go? How close to those UMFUS base stations can you get? All of these things change, but that's all part of the cycle of innovation, SpaceX would say. On the other hand, you have operators like SES and O3b saying, look, you're completely redesigning your system. This is not a tweak. This is not an iteration. We're trying to build our business model around a known set of assumptions, and you are changing the rules of the game with your redesigned system. And so it goes back to what we were saying earlier about, is this rewarding rules, or is it trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number? I don't know. The commission doesn't know either, or at least hasn't told us yet. And we're gonna have to think about how that breaks out going forward. So to kind of, go back a little bit, we've got this basic tension that I mentioned throughout. And I wanted to come back to that quote that I offered from Freud in the beginning. I only gave you part of the quote. There's a little dependent clause at the outset that I think is really important to keep in mind. It's not just the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. It's one day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. I think we have some more time to get there still, to that one day, in retrospect, part of that discussion. But I think it's really important that we have the debate, and that you be a part of it, and that we all try to arrive at what the right policy is for commercial space, for individual operators, and for us, as to, as we move forward through, all these cycles of discussion and engagement with the commission and with each other.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. And, on all levels, I mean, there's a lot of technical information here. There, we are talking about literally mankind reaching for the heavens. As you noted at the very top, we are talking about the vast increase in satellites proposed and being built, well beyond anything we've seen in the history of our species. And it's raising, so much. And so it is appropriate to talk about our deep thinkers. And are we talking about, the greatest good for all? Are we talking about rule following? Are we talking about, Freudian aspects of this? And I think you did mention also that there are a variety of other discussions that can spin off of this. Full disclosure, I've been involved in something called the Balance Group, which is looking at the meta issues in a broader, even broader stroke. How will all these constellations impact a variety of other systems on the ground, including, bird migration to, I think we had a discussion or a question earlier about, fixed services, and there's a whole variety of subsets to really talk about that the FCC itself, as you amply noted, it's not even sure entirely of its own rules and whether it should modify its own rules. And are there other federal and state and local and international agencies expertise at play here, or should be at play here, because of the massive scope of what we're talking about? So that, that kind of really invites so many more discussions. And I think those discussions, regardless, are coming because of just the size and scope and the ambition of mankind, or humankind, I should say. So I don't know if you have any reflections on any of that, Trey, or
No, I think you're absolutely right. We have only scratched the surface. I think there are a lot of different issues. One is visual clutter. There is a whole line of thought. If you're poking around on the web right now, you'll see video, time-lapse video, where you can actually see SpaceX's satellites in orbit in the night sky. Now you have to have, there are limits to the naked eye on how you can see these, but they're visible. And you have to wonder, and I think people are wondering, well, what does that mean? Is that some kind of risk, either to individuals' enjoyment of the planet or to migratory bird paths or other factors? So that is clearly a factor. The other issue is orbital debris. You saw all those satellites up there. The commission has a number of proceedings on how to deal with orbital debris. It's not always true that what goes up must come down. It will eventually, but it might be 100 years or more. And so there are pretty stringent rules on deorbit and decommissioning. And by and large, these LEOs will come down, but there are limits on different types of propellant you can use, because at those speeds, even a 3 millimeter piece of debris acts like has the mass and force of a bowling ball, traveling at 60 miles an hour. So if it hits something, it's going to do some damage, and that could have a cascading effect in that orbit. And so a lot of operators are concerned about how you navigate these highly desirable low Earth orbit portions of the band and how you allocate them, because like spectrum, those orbital paths are limited in number, and they are highly prized depending on the type of service you want to provide. And so the FCC, the ITU, other bodies worldwide will have a big voice in how those rights are awarded and what's done to protect them. And there is a really active debate internationally about how to do that, how best to do that. And especially when you're talking about an area where different nation states have different standards and levels of autonomy to pursue their own path. So, it is a shared enterprise at some very fundamental level.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of literally riveting issues here, and this is a great précis, a great overview, and it's probably a call to stay tuned for more. I think we'll, as an industry and other industries, are going to get more and more involved in trying to understand these issues, and hopefully NSMA and will be part of it, and I'm sure it will be. And Trey, you've got many decades in this area, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of you out and about in those discussions. So thank you again. We're incredibly pleased with your expertise and your willingness to come on and talk with our spectrum managers around the globe. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, Joe. I can't thank you enough. Thanks for the opportunity, and good luck with it. I hope we can stay in touch.
You got it. Okay. You got it. Take care. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.